Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping in the chat to purchase something wonderful, and that'll be from the Politics and Prose website. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A feature, which can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, click on the live transcript option, also at the bottom of your screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Jo Lloyd won the BBC National Short Story Award in 2019 and an O. Henry Prize in 2018. Her stories have appeared in Zoetrope, All Story, Ploughshares, The Southern Review, and elsewhere. Something Wonderful is her debut collection. She grew up in South Wales, where she now lives. Lloyd will be in conversation with Emily Nemens. Emily Nemens' debut novel, The Cactus League, was named one of the best books of 2020 by NPR and Lit Hub. Emily spent a decade editing the literary quarterlies, the Paris Review, and the Southern Review. She lives in New York and is working on her second novel. Please join me in welcoming them both to PNP Live. Ladies.
Thank you. Thank you, Chelsea, for introducing us, and Jo, thank you for sharing your launch with all of us. You know, I first encountered your work, I think it was in 2013 when you mailed something, Your Magic Summer, via international post to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And to encounter it again in Something Wonderful felt like running into a friend on the street. It's just such a vivid story, and you know, you enter into like with all of your stories, you enter at a very exciting moment, but in particular in that one, the reader is thrown into a F-bomb laden argument between Carmen and Duncan, two people we don't know yet and don't know that we should care about yet. And this really magical thing happens where over the course of the story, you begin to understand why they're fighting and what they're fighting for. And there's this remarkable density of information and nuance and detailed backstory and forward action without being cumbersome. And the fact that the story actually ends up being about Lottie and Sheila in a lot of ways is just this remarkable sort of round off back handspring tumbling routine of really deft prose and wonderful storytelling. So imagine my delight when going through Something Wonderful. I feel like all of the stories in this collection really had that same kind of richness and narrative expertise. So congratulations on a beautiful collection.
Thank you so much.
Oh, of course. I thought maybe it would be fun to start with flagging one of the most notable things about Something Wonderful as you're moving from story to story is that there are two modes within the collection. There's contemporary stories like Your Magic Summer, which are, you know, set in the last, I don't know, 15 to 20 years perhaps. And then these very ambitious and a little strange or at least a little more unfamiliar pieces of historical fiction. And because this is a book launch, I'd love to hear you read from the book a bit. And I thought it might be fun to toggle between a bit of that historical tone and something more contemporary.
Yeah, I'm glad you said unfamiliar, because that was one of the things I wanted with the historical stories. I don't really think of them as historical exactly. I think of them as almost like science fiction, you know, they're you're in a different place. So should I read something now?
Yeah, maybe let's do one and then we can jump into the other one in a little bit.
Okay, shall I start with contemporary or historical? Well, I might start with historical because that comes up first in the book. I thought I would read a bit from My Bonnie, which is a story that was based on research I did into long forgotten ancestors on my mother's side who lived in a port town in Scotland, Arbroath. And because they were long forgotten, they really left nothing behind except the census records that just give the bare facts about their names, their dates of birth, and their occupations as they move from job to job. I used to wonder what I would have done if I'd lived in the 18th or 19th century. And because I read a lot of Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell and things like that, I thought I would have been a governess because they're always governesses or wives. And that sounded like an okay thing. But doing research into my family, I found out I wouldn't have been a governess. I would have been working in a factory. I would have been in a linen mill alongside the whole of the rest of my family, because by the end of this story, as by the end of the census records, they are all working in the mill in various capacities. And at the beginning of this story, James, who is a sailor, dies, leaving his widow, Agnes, and a baby son, leaving them destitute, actually. And in the section I'm going to read, they introduce themselves to James's distant cousin, Euphemia. So I'm going to read from that bit, Euphemia. By a combination of intelligence, thrift, and reluctance to bestir so much as one finger except to her own immediate advantage, Euphemia Simon had kept the small general grocery on Muir Street for 3 decades, first with her husband and then without. After his death, she had a low upholstered chair carried into a corner of the shop, and there she sat, comforting herself with licorice and coconut ice, sugared almonds, and candied violets. As the years went by, Euphemia expanded to fill the chair and gradually to spill over its edges. Sugar draped crystalline, frosty webs across her memory so that the details of her earlier life softened and receded. She found fault with the girls nowadays, marrying too young and squandering their pennies on collars and China tea, with the wives who skimped on mending and with those whose husbands wore patched clothes, with the mothers who kept their children in school and those who sent them out into the blighted sea fogs of autumn to risk scarlet fever, whooping cough and measles, the disease to which, some 25 years earlier, she had lost both her children in the space of a week. Euphemia was James's cousin by marriage. He had been a man poor in relatives, so when she heard of his death, she expected his relics to turn up, and so they did. Agnes, with the baby thrashing in her arms, stumbled through routine flatteries and pleadings, while Euphemia, not mentioning the very recent departure in disgrace of her moon-eyed maid of all work, looked the pair over. She listened to the child's furious roars and thought it unlikely to be struck down by any of the 1,000 poxes. She saw that Agnes, although short, was sturdy and determined. She judged her not so pleasing as to distract the gentleman, nor so displeasing as to tire a mistress's eyes. Agnes scrubbed, swept, swilled, roasted, boiled, rinsed, scoured, emptied, mended, scalded, starched, while Euphemia sat in her corner, offering occasional advice or criticism. "You are fortunate," she told Agnes often, and no one would have disagreed, even as Agnes's heart withered like a rosehip. In Euphemia's own veins, small threads of remembrance wormed forth and then burst, and she knew this, too, was fortunate. Euphemia took a special interest in John. He had the same broad face as his father, the same far-sighted blue eyes, even, one would swear, the same tilt to his walk. She would tempt him with sugar mice and marzipan pigs, and as he stood at her knee with sticky face and fingers, she would tell him about the press gangs that ranged up and down the coast when she was young. Parents hiding their children in trunks and cellars and pot cupboards. She told him the fates of the boys who were taken, of those, more foolish, who ran away to sea. The beatings, the sickness, the stench, the never-ending work, the dry tacks soaked in coffee until the weevils formed a scummy layer on top. The boys who crashed from rigging to deck, or had their bones peeled clean by chains and ropes. The boys who died. The boys whose bodies were twisted to cages of pain so that they begged for death. She described the death of his father, which she had seen for herself in the bare acidic reaches of the night, the groans and shudders of the vessel, the planks folding underfoot, icy water waist then neck high, men sliding unstoppable through the splintered decks, cursing and screaming and then silenced as the ship plummeted into glacial blackness. Up on the surface, the unlucky few who had jumped or fallen clear floated for an hour or more in the moonlight, calling to each other, their limbs growing first cold, then insensate, their voices failing as beside them, dripping salt and phosphorescence, rose monsters with the faces of angels and huge, uncurious eyes. If Agnes disliked Euphemia's idea of education, she did not say so. She took John to the sailcloth factory at the age of 9. If John had other ambitions, he did not voice them, remaining silent throughout the transaction and afterwards taking up his new responsibilities without protest. When Euphemia died, Agnes was fortunate again, quickly finding employment in the newest flax mill and room for her and John in the shadow of its chimney. The wind and the rain seemed to visit that corner of town with especial interest. Agnes slept with her hands over her ears. Sometimes she still dreamt, as she had since she was a child, that the sea did not stop at high tide, but kept rising up the hill until it lay all around in a rippling, hushed mass. This time, she thought every time, it is not a dream. Stop there.
Thank you. That was beautiful. So you touched on it briefly, but research. In the case of this story, did you research first, interest in your family history, and then think, I want to turn this into a story? I guess I often wondered, a chicken and the egg situation of, did you encounter extinct butterflies from, the early part of the 20th century first and think, I want to write about this? Or did you think, I want to write about butterflies, and then went to the archive?
Well, on the butterfly story, I found a particular person, this woman who I called Dottie, is actually based on somebody who lived quite near where I am now, and had discovered a new species. And there was something remarkable about that in this sort of unremarkable corner of the world where I am. This woman had lived this long life with her husband and children, and then become a lepidopterist and gone out and done extraordinary things. So yeah, that was what got me interested in that. So then I had to go and find out about butterflies, although not too much, because I think, I'm sure you'll agree, Emily, that you don't actually need to know everything about these subjects when you're writing fiction. It is fiction. You're not giving a survey of lepidoptery in the early 20th century. You're using what you want to tell a story. So it's more about, I think, not getting it wrong than, doing proper historical research like a proper historian.
Yeah,
I know some historians, and really they don't think I'm any kind of historian.
Well, I'm sure they're impressed, but maybe not historical text. No, I know when I was writing, I'd get to a point where there was like a baseball detail in it, and think, okay, did I get this right? And if not, I have to figure out an answer. And it was sort of a like a pause or a stop. So
and of course you've written historical stories as well. I mean, one of your earlier stories that was the one on the map, the Zoetrope.
Yeah,
and the passenger pigeon story. So this is something you've done also, swapping between the historical and the contemporary.
Yeah, and certainly, and I'm always just curious, where that seed germinates, if it's an object. For me, it was seeing a map in a library and thinking, okay, what can I write about with that? But it's fascinating to sort of hear about the different ways things begin. Did you want to maybe also the origin story or the kernel for The Invisible? I'd love to hear.
The Invisible, yeah. So that was, the honest truth is, I was looking through the Dictionary of Welsh National Biography online because I wanted to see how many women were there, because they know this themselves. Women are very poorly represented because they have a lot of historical material from a long time ago, and they're working now to put more women in, but women are very poorly represented. So I was just trawling through looking for women's names, and I came across this woman, Martha. Knew she was a woman because she was called Martha, and her sort of summary description was imposter. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I looked her up, and it said that she told her she was she lived in 18th century Wales. She told her neighbours that wealthy invisible people lived among them, came to their fairs and markets, and visited her in her cottage. And I was fascinated by this idea that not only were these people visible, but they were also wealthy. And then at the same time, so the idea that, you know, I was interested in her being something slightly different from an imposter. Right. And at the same time, a friend of mine's mother was in hospital, and she was also being visited by invisible people. And this was, you know, something she took very matter-of-factly. Invisible people came. Some of them were people she'd known. Some of them were not. They were, you know, World War I soldiers or whatever. And yeah, so those two things that came together in that very short space of time, a couple of weeks, I think, started that story.
Can you, that's fascinating. Can you sort of talk through the process? I imagine it was a long one in that, you know, work was published first in 2009. One of the stories in this collection dates, at least an early version of it, goes back that way. So I think I would guess I'm not the only one who would love to sort of hear about the generative process. You know, we talked a bit about research, but in terms of writing, do you write it all in one go? Are you toggling between a couple of projects and a couple of stories at once? And how do you know it's done? And
so Work was the first story I ever published. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to keep it in the book. It quite seemed like a marker at one end. And at that time, I think I did work more quickly. I don't think that story took a very long time. But as I went on reading more and more short stories, reading particularly US short stories when I was starting to publish in US magazines, one of the things about US stories, it seemed to me, was that they were pushing the boundaries perhaps more than many UK stories were doing. So it raised the bar for me, reading more of those stories, and my own stories started to take longer. I guess they became more complex. My Bonnie, the first story in the book, the one I just read from, was the first story I wrote that was set in a different time, and that did take a very long time to write. Doing the research into just the background of what it would be like to live in a port town in Scotland at that time took a long time, and actually just finding a form for it took a long time. I knew that I wanted to write about Agnes, who I kept seeing pop up in the census every 10 years. But it took me a long time to find a form, and it was only when I really hit on the different, moving between the different characters and just moving completely into that character that it really fell into place. And when I think about it now, it actually seems quite an obvious form for something that was inspired by census records, where you do just see these snapshots every 10 years. But at the time, yeah, it took me a long time to find that.
Yeah, that form is one that I saw sort of echoed or maybe reprised in different stories, in that you have these almost microcosms or sections that are titled that, a reader might glance at the page and be like, oh, it's fragments, or, but it becomes much more elliptical and dense in terms of compounding what happens across the course of the whole story. was that, I mean, you said it makes a lot of sense in terms of the census for my Bonnie, but can you speak a little bit more about that fragmentary style?
So again, being perfectly honest, I've never been honest before about this, but I remember picking up a copy of A Public Space, you know, the US Literature Journal. And there was a writer in there who was new to me, Tom Drury. I'd never heard of him before. And I read what I took to be a short story, and it moved between these characters very suddenly. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is just the most amazing short story. And of course, I subsequently found out it wasn't short. It was the beginning of the third Grouse Country trilogy, in fact. And when I looked at more of him, of course, I found all the Grouse Country trilogies and found the same characters. But this idea of moving between the characters like that, completely shifting viewpoint and scene, was what I really took away from that. As well as huge admiration for Tom Drury, my absolute hero. But yeah, that it was just something I found I like to do in stories. It gives you this ability to change the scene very suddenly. You don't have to have any of that boring shoe leather stuff where people are, you know, walking from room to room, or getting from here to there. You can just jump. And of course, if you only do that once in a story, it doesn't really work. But if you do it, you know, if that's the form the story takes, it gives you that ability to move quickly and change scene.
Yeah.
Without the boring stuff.
I think you did it to great effect as well in Aid, Cindy, Kurt, Me, with splashes in between. And that story does the double duty of giving readers a little bit of an ear for the contemporary voice. So I'd love to hear a bit from that.
Sure. So Aid, Cindy, Kurt, Me. So this story is the me of this story, who's called Trish, is living above the blue bar, the pokey little blue bar, as she calls it, with Aid, who she describes as being the nicest man you could ever hope to meet. And I think it's fair to say that she feels ambivalent about how nice he is. She's not quite sure that's a good thing. And she does a bit of art. I mean, mostly she really lives off Aid, but she also does a little art, and their friend Cindy sells her art in Cindy's shop. And I'm going to read from the bit where we first meet Cindy. Where's the birthday boy? Sorry, that wasn't where I was going to be. Scratch that. There was a knock at the back door, and simultaneously it opened, and I knew who it would be. Cindy was always turning up at odd hours and letting herself in, like she had a right to be there. She was carrying a parcel wrapped in expensive handmade paper I had seen in her shop, and that was when I remembered. Fuck. Where's the birthday boy? Said Cindy. He's gone out, I said. I was flushing from the joint assault of forgetting and remembering, and particularly remembering right in front of Cindy, so I turned round to hide it. How's he taking it? Being old, she meant. He was quite a few years older than me, although not, in fact, older than Cindy. Fairly well, I said. Did you take him breakfast in bed? Coffee, toast, 2 kinds of jam, I said, turning back to face her. She looked at me sternly. Trish? Yep. Please tell me you didn't forget. Of course not. She stared me down. We can celebrate later, I said. Come to the bar this evening. Bring your present. What is it anyway? Can we go halves? So typical of you. She meant forgetting. This is why you will never hold a relationship together. That was out of line. If people tell you their secret fears, you shouldn't slap them in the face with said fears when you have an argument. Cindy was tall and thin, scrawny, you might say, if you were being uncharitable, with a long face and very straight blonde hair that she trimmed herself every now and then when she remembered, as if she rose above such things. Also, she had enormous feet. The one time we did that girly thing, trying on each other's clothes before going out, her part in which was largely to sit on the bed looking disapproving, I'd been amazed at her shoes, like dress-up shoes when you're a kid. I put them on and walked around the room laughing, saying, "Just how big are your feet, Cindy? Are you secretly an ogre or what?" She didn't care. Cindy never tried to be anything other than what she was. She didn't try to make people like her. She didn't smile at her customers, or anyone really, that social smile everyone does. It had unnerved me at first, but you got used to it. As I say, Cindy had been Aidy's friend before she was mine, and whenever there was any sort of tension between us, between me and her, or between me and him, she dropped me like dirt and went back to being his friend. This was Cindy's and my relationship. 1. She would look down her nose at the pictures I brought her, picking through them, putting aside ones she thought weren't up to scratch and telling me why not in a tactful way at all. 2. She would show me, by way of contrast, other things she got for the shop, the good stuff. She knew a lot about design. She'd gone to college as an adult, taken a degree in something visual, and she could talk your ears off about it. "Look at the artless artfulness of this," she would say, picking up a bowl or a candlestick or something. "Look at the textury texture, the liney lines." 3. She would nag me about Aidy. She said I wasn't kind enough to him. If I snapped at him, she'd give me a hard time for days. If I was even a bit offhand, or I teased him about his earrings or said, "Wake up, Aidy," she'd dig me in the ribs and hiss. It was hard to tell if she wanted me to leave him or marry him. She was forever going on about what a good dad he'd make, and saying he shouldn't waste his best daddy with someone who didn't want kids, and did I want kids? 4. I would say, "Why don't you fuck off and mind your own business and get yourself a boyfriend so you have something to think about other than me and Aidy?" 5. We'd meet up, just her and me, once a week or so, and forget about all of the above and talk about the things that bonded us together, like how we'd left home as teenagers and been basically responsible for ourselves ever since, and how this had made us spiky and outspoken, disinclined to put up with nonsense, and unable so far to ever feel we quite belonged anywhere. We could talk for hours until we were either laughing or crying, and if anyone had asked us right at that moment, we'd have sworn undying love for each other.
That was wonderful to hear. It reminds me, you're so funny. Some of these stories are just have such sharp lines, and it's funny sharp, but also there's some pretty mean characters and a couple of real blow-up fights. How do you write those, Jo?
It's funny. I think that I don't totally agree with any of the characters in the book. There are a few I might totally disagree with, but I don't think there's any I totally agree with. So when they argue with each other, I find it fairly easy to take both sides. And I think that's it. I put myself in each head and see what they say. I think with an argument, I think it's important to get, you can't have a one-sided argument in a story. You need to give both sides, some good material.
Right, and if one person's, or one voice is too righteous, it just gets a bit boring. I just want to sidebar, a couple of questions came in while you're reading, which is great. Folks should continue to chime in with questions for Jo, and we'll spend the last few minutes of the hour answering those. So thank you. And the other thing that you shared in that section was a really wonderful list. I think there's a lot of lists, and My Bonnie, what you read, the Euphemia section, also had a couple of lists, not numbered or bulleted the same way, but some really good sort of accounting. How do those come together? Is it all in one fell swoop? Do you have an even longer list that you need to trim back? How do you find that rhythm?
Well, in something like My Bonnie, I don't know. These lists just seem sort of natural there. In Cindy Kurt Aid Me, that was one of the things I really wanted to do with that story. I was interested in sort of using a sort of more contemporary, almost an office communication style in there. I like a bullet point list in a story. It's nice. I use a lot of them outside my fiction, so it's nice to see them. Somebody told me that using lists was postmodern, and maybe so. I don't know.
I mean, I guess so. I feel like it's also a bit Victorian, right?
Yeah. I think with the historical stories, you can get very caught up in the words, in the strange things. I mean, in The Invisible, there's a section about food, and some of that food is out of my head, and some of it is from contemporary cookery books, and those are things that it's just nice to enjoy those things when you're writing that sort of story, to enjoy some of the strangeness, some of the odd things that people ate.
What was maybe the oddest thing that you encountered?
I guess some of that food was definitely some of the oddest things. I think there were all the tiny birds that they ate, the larks. I mean the idea of going out and eating a bird as tiny as a lark. I don't know if you have larks in America, and stewing it in cream. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it wasn't necessarily strange, but as a reader, I was unsettled. I'm just looking towards my notes; they're all over my desk. But with Deep Shelter, describing the hostel and sort of the strange liminal space of London after World War II. The story is nominally about the future and space exploration, but I feel like there was so much there. Also about the strangeness of that time, and
I was really interested in that, how people would have felt about that then. It was just 6 years after the war ended, and we're all living in such a strange time now. I mean, it's not a war, but the lockdowns have made such a dramatic difference to our lives, and for many people in Britain at that time, one of the main effects would have been a kind of lockdown. And it's interesting to wonder what we will think about this now in 5 years' time. Will this just seem like the tiniest bump that we, barely remember, or will it seem like something that has really affected our lives? Because a lot of the people I've met from that generation, don't seem to give the impression that the war that they lived through was something that completely changed their lives. But I guess in that story, I did want to have it still there as a presence, even in the festival that was celebrating, as you say, the future.
Absolutely. Have you started writing about or reading about this current strange moment?
No. Have you?
No. I have a fairly isolated character in one piece, and it that comes easily.
I wonder.
They're geographically isolated, not because of a raging virus. But,
did you start to see a lot of COVID stuff coming in at Paris Review? Was it too soon?
It was a little too soon. I did see some, it was from writers whose work I'd known and published before, or who I'd read, write historical fiction or do things entirely different, trying to wrap their heads around this contemporary moment, and didn't publish any of it because none of it felt quite right. I think I was more interested in stories that came at it obliquely or coincidentally. I'm thinking of, Jamel Brinkley wrote a story about a brother and sister, and the brother's couch surfing and in Brooklyn, and it's just, everyone's sort of on top of one another. And, we started working on it before pandemic, but then this idea of a family sort of in close quarters and getting in one another's grills and feeling so much uncertainty felt very resonant. So, but of course I was reading things like, you know, in the Times they had the Decameron Project and were commissioning sort of, you know, write as quickly as possible about the strange thing that's happening in the world.
Yeah.
So I certainly started to encounter it. This might be a good moment, you know, speaking about what I'm reading or what I've read in the US, to talk about maybe that sort of funny, not funny, the situation of the British short story versus the American one. You know, I was heartened to hear that you picked up more American literary journals and that really upped your game. I wonder if there were particular writers beyond Tom that really resonated with you, or magazines that.
So many, honestly. I mean, I did spend 10 years doing almost nothing but reading almost nothing but short stories. So I mean, there are writers I guess that I come back to because they are writers that I can read when I'm having trouble with something. I can read them and it just sort of like shifts my brain again. So those are people like Rebecca Lee, Karen Russell, Jim Shepherd, Caitlin Horrocks, Canish Thro, Joanne Beard, who I wish would publish a whole book because I love the few short stories that she's put out. Joan Silber is somebody I hugely admire. And actually, at the moment, I think I've read everything that she's written now. So I've gone back to the only thing I hadn't read, which was one of her earlier ones, The Size of the World. I love her writing, the fluidity of it. But you ask about the British short story, and I guess I think it's true that the people who've made an impression on your side of the Atlantic have tended to be Irish. So you know, you've got Daniel McLaughlin and names escape me, but I think they've tended to be more Irish. And
yeah, William Trevor was
William Trevor, of course,
really important one for me, certainly.
And I really don't know the writers who over here are considered, you know, specialist short story writers, so like Sarah Hall, Ali Smith, who also writes novels, of course, David Constantine, people like that. I don't know how much they are read in the US.
Yeah, a little, not as much. You know, and I was talking to someone about this the other day as I was getting ready to speak with you, and you know, they posited, you know, it all goes back to the 19th century and the serial novel versus what was going on in the US with newspapers doing one-off stories, and like that divide has sort of set the course of short fiction in both countries ever since. And that felt a bit reductive, but I do wonder, you know, I think it's telling that Best American Short Stories and O. Henry both turned 100 recently, and
right.
Two major story prizes in the UK are 15 years old. That's
true. I mean, one of the things in the UK is, of course, there are just far less literary journals. There are far less places to publish short stories. And in Britain, a lot of writers get their start, as I did, by entering small competitions. You work your way up to big competitions like the BBC, but there are lots and lots of small competitions that writers can enter. But the problem with those is that I think, although they're a great way to start, absolutely, but they don't really have a readership outside the competition entrants, whereas literary journals, there are so many literary journals in the US, and they do have some sort of a readership, whether they have the bigger journals that have huge readerships or small journals that, but we just don't have that culture. And part of it, I think also is that the fiction MFA is much older in the States than it is here. There are a lot more of them now, but 20 years ago there was probably only the one in Norwich. And short stories, I believe, are the mainstay of that kind of course. So that immediately drives up interest.
Certainly. Yeah, and I think the MFA apparatus in the US perpetuates just, there's a lot more short stories being written here. Did you ever think of, of trying longer form, or you said this last 10 years you've just been focused on short fiction? I mean, no would be a great answer, because I love this sort of the wildly dense long short story. I think is probably my favorite form, but I'm curious if you tried to write smaller, write bigger.
And also one of the things I love is second collections. There's been two really cracking ones this year, the Danielle Evans Office of Historical Corrections and the Kaylin Horrocks. So I'm always actually slightly sad when short story writers say, I'm working on something longer now, but I may be working on something longer. So.
Okay. Well, as long as there's a second collection someday, Jo, as long as stories are still a part of your digest, I'll be okay. That sounds great. I do see that more questions are coming in, so maybe we can jump over to a few. One attendee asks about if any stories from this last decade didn't make it into the book, left on the cutting room floor. And I guess, we haven't talked about sort of the politics of the project, but there is this, sort of refrain of starting with work. I think what the true struggle of the kitchen hierarchy is brought up, but there is, class struggle and thinking about protest and the proletariat in different iterations across the collection. So when did you understand that would be the project of the book, and
possibly never. It may just have been almost accidental as that being my it isn't that I was particularly interested in protest or industrialization or any of those things. I think I was more interested in people who weren't particularly represented in historical records, say. So especially in my Bonnie, that's clearly the interest there, people who don't have voices, giving them voices. But I think that is something that runs through the collection, and so when you're doing that, the political side is just comes through. I mean, when I was researching my Bonnie, one of the things that really interested me was the idea of how much freedom the Industrial Revolution gave people. Although it brought all these bad things, actually working in factories gave people a lot of freedom. It gave them a new economic freedom, and it gave them a new political freedom. It gave them, it gave them voices, and that was interesting to me. So, yeah.
And in terms
but
of,
there were stories that were left on the cutting room floor.
Okay.
And it's partly getting a balance, isn't it,
right.
in a collection?
I was going to say cutting room never to see the light of day, or cutting room that it didn't feel like it fit within the project of this book.
Yeah, they're probably never going to see the light of day.
Okay. How about the ordering? I mean, there is a bit of cadence between, the spooky or the other, as you put it at the start of the hour, and more contemporary, but did it feel natural, or did you have, quite a merry-go-round of shifting?
I always knew that I wanted to alternate the stories set in other times with the contemporary stories. But I also really wanted to alternate things like whether they were in first person or third person, whether they were funny or more sad, whether they, you know, the characters was old or young. I wanted to I really wanted to variety in that. So I wanted each story to be different from the one before. So I laid them all out in colored folders and put them different colors to denote different things, and then tried to get a nice sort of rainbow effect.
That works. In terms of these stories, you know, you talked about work came pretty quickly, and then My Bonnie took longer and was a next step. I'm wondering, you know, maybe what was the hardest nut to crack? What was the story among these that took the longest to write? And if you could talk a little bit about, you know, the bumps of, and the victories of that process.
I think possibly it was the last story in the book, The Earth, Thy Great Exchequer, Ready Lies. I took a long time to write that, partly because it daunted me. Mm-hmm. The amount I felt I had to know to write it daunted me. So, you know, when you get interested in an idea like that, you often just start writing. That's what I do anyway. I just start writing, I think, and you're immediately brought up short. You immediately realize you don't know enough to write this. Mm-hmm. So then going away and doing a lot of reading and getting bored with the reading and starting again, and then realizing I still had to read more, and then just finding the shape. I think finding the shape for expressing the thing that interested me in that person. So yeah, that was probably the one that took the longest.
And I'm curious, with several of these were in magazines. We talked about the Southern Review and Zoetrope and the O. Henry anthology. Did you get back into them in advance of the book, or did you feel?
Sorry.
Did you get back into the stories in advance of book publication, or did the versions that appeared in the magazine feel good? I
found it difficult to make many changes to them because it almost feels to me like once they're out in the world, it's almost cheating to change them then. So I tweaked a few words, but I didn't change them very much. And of course, you know, they've been very well edited, very thoroughly edited by people like yourself and Michael Ray at Zoetrope. So, you know, they'd been through some good eyes by the time they came to doing the book. So no, I didn't make that many changes.
Okay. A couple of people are asking about Cassandra, the horse. Is this Cassandra on the cover? Who knows? Cassandra is a talking horse who appears very charmingly in that last story. Did you always know that you would have her talk?
No, but that was a bit of a breakthrough, actually. actually, Cassandra coming in at the beginning actually was one of the things that helped me find the form for that story. When Cassandra sort of developed her personality, that helped the story a lot. You know, every story has to have a talking horse. It always improves the story, I think, to have a talking horse.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a few horses in the stories, as another reader pointed out. I guess, you know, the beasts of burden, obviously, they're helping these people move through landscapes that they wouldn't otherwise be able to navigate.
There's
great horses.
I like writing animals. There's a few dogs in there as well, and quite a personable cow, and I like writing those. They're nice, uncomplicated personalities to write.
Did that, I mean, they're uncomplicated, perhaps they're charming for certain, but, you know, I think another theme along with the politics is sort of the landscape and the environmental, our capacity to live with the land or to exploit the land. Was that in play, like when you were writing about these?
So, I mean, the character of Tall John in The Earth, Thy Great Exchequer was very definitely influenced by ideas about common land and the clearings and the common. I mean, a lot of people think that the clearings only happened in Scotland. In fact, they happened all over the UK, and common land that people had lived off for centuries was enclosed, and they could no longer live off it. And it was happened at a very convenient time because places like HM's factories now wanted them to come and work for him. So yeah, that was very definitely in my mind, and protecting the landscape and seeing what I get. You know, that was one of the parallels I wanted to draw in that story was HM's complete dismissal of the landscape as wastes, and the fact that we can be perhaps a little like that now, even unless land is being used for something, we don't appreciate it.
Right. Well, Duncan from Your Magic Summer is an environmental activist, and or he's trying his best to be one, I suppose. And I wonder, I mean, that was written, 8 years ago. I don't know timing wise when you started it and finished it exactly, but I feel like the environmental movement has moved even since that time.
Very much, yeah.
How does it feel to spend time now with Duncan and think about, his
well, so one of the things that interested me in Duncan was the idea of how you balance your political views and your wish to change the world with a personal life and other, the other things you do in your life. And Duncan, it has to be said, doesn't manage that very well, but he shouldn't obviously be taken as an example of how to do it well. But I was more interested in that, in the balancing of those things than in his actual protest.
Got it. Wonderful. Becky is wanting to know, and I want to know as well. In terms of your descriptions, we talked about the list a bit, but descriptions writ large, do they come to you immediately, or is it something that's teased out? And I suppose I would ask the same question about dialogue. Does that sort of exchange when they're fighting or when they're loving or however it happens, do those things come slowly but come together, or is it something that's teased out through revision?
I think the descriptions tend to come fairly quickly because they're often the thing that gets me into the story. I kind of feel like I need to have some work that I'm happy with before I can continue a story, and that is often descriptions. Dialogue, I would say I've struggled with more, I work on the dialogue. I have to leave gaps for dialogue sometimes, and then I have to remind myself this is not this. Tom Drury, again, I'm going to mention him, writes the most wonderful dialogue, and unless it's as good as Tom Drury, it's really not good enough. So I guess I try and make the dialogue better than it starts off.
Yeah, I think Deborah Eisenberg does a pretty good dialogue.
Oh yeah.
Who are your, other than Tom again, are there new discoveries in the story space that you're excited about? Who are you digging on now?
Actually, somebody who I think you admire as well, her collection, I cannot wait for this collection to come out, the Lydia Conkling collection.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another thing, excuse me, that's interesting about the US and UK short story. In the UK, it's very common for somebody to put out a collection that without having published any stories in journals. Whereas Lydia is somebody I've been following her short stories in journals for, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems very common in the US, that you pick up a collection and you read in the front all the places that stories have been published, and that often helps me decide whether to buy a collection or not. But it's excuse me, much less common in the UK.
Yeah. Wonderful. And can you talk at all about what you're researching these days, or what's the focus of your laser, I guess?
No, I don't think I can.
That's fair. I
find if you talk about stuff, it kind of sort of sets it, and that's very bad. It has to stay fluid for a long time, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you agree? I'd love to know what you're working on, but you don't have to say.
There's some waves involved.
Okay.
I feel the same. I mean, I think it's more superstition for me. I feel wildly cagey about overpromising, or if it, if you speak about it before it's manifest, it might not manifest. But that just makes me sound a bit superstitious. So
no, I think that sounds completely rational to me.
But what is manifest is something wonderful, which is out in the US as of yesterday. So congratulations on a really beautiful collection, Jo. I think it's great. We have, I think, just a minute or two if there are any other questions. But otherwise, I would just, thank everyone for joining us and for the good questions. And thank you to Chelsea and everyone at Politics and Prose for.
Absolutely. And thank you, Emily, for doing such a lovely job.
It was my pleasure, Jo.
Well, thank you both. I think I speak for everyone when I say I wish we had a little bit more time, but we do have 2 minutes. If you both want to let us know, if you wouldn't mind, what's on your nightstand? What are you reading now?
I just finished Benita Blackburn's collection, which came out, I guess, last week. And it's lovely. And Ashley Nelson Levy's Immediate Family, which also came out last week, which is it's such a wild concept. It's a speech to be delivered to her brother on the occasion of his wedding, and obviously it's much more digressive, sort of like the whole concept of Rachel Cusk's novel that's epistolary, but of course not. But I loved Benita's book and Ashley's both.
Jo?
Well, it's interesting. Rachel Cusk. I'm always reading many things at once, but Rachel Cusk's latest Second Place is one of the things I'm reading. It's wonderful, and also a slightly older collection. Catherine Heine. What's it called? Single, Carefree, Mellow. Actually, in the story that phrase comes from, it's Single, Carefree, Mellow, Dogless, but they didn't include Dogless in the title.
Well,
good dogs.
Well, thank you both so much, Jo and Emily, for joining us today. Thank everyone out there for also being here. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this, and we wouldn't be able to do it without the book sales to support them. So as a gentle reminder, the link to purchase Something Wonderful has been placed in the chat. It'll take you to the Politics and Prose website. While you're there, please check out the calendar. We'd love to see you at another event. In the meantime, please stay well and well read. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.